Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to look at the resource allocation within the different market types and how the scarcity of resources impacts these markets. Okay, so the first question here we're going to ask is, can central planning be successful? One of the things we looked at in that last unit was the fact that what we had a market economy on one side. We had a planned economy on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. The reality is most economies fit somewhere in between along these lines. So what we see is this idea of a mixed economy in which there's market principles, but there's also planned economic principles involved, and they work along this line from one extreme to the other. So even though as we move towards the left, we lose efficiency in the market, that does not automatically doom the economy to failure. In other words, even though we're moving from a market economy towards a planned economy in some aspects of the economy, it doesn't automatically mean that economics, that market is going to fail. Planned economies within a small section of the economy can be successful. So if we're looking at a very small section, which is what microeconomics is analyzing, if we look at that small section of the market, what we can see is that sometimes that planned economy can actually be successful, whereas in that market economy might fail. And it's one of the things we said about market economies is sometimes they do fail, and therefore sometimes the government intervenes. So anytime we see government intervention, we're seeing this move towards a planned economy. So the key to success is the size of the market and the degree to which planning takes place. At no point are we going to see 100% planned economics within a market economy, which you will see aspects of it, obviously. And so as we go through the course, you'll see how governments use different policies to create equity. Remember, the whole thing here is that in a market economy, we have 100% efficiency. In a planned economy, we're looking at trying to create 100% equity. So as we move from that market to that planned economy, we're losing the efficiency in order to create the equity. And so that's something the government will use policies to do. So we see here enact as planned economies within sections of the U.S. economy, and that's what we'll get to here before too long. So we said that the market is pretty much the best way to allocate resources, but the thing about it is it's not the only way. So we want to look at some other ways to allocate resources. So the first year's majority rule. So voters determine how scarce resources in society will be allocated. So in a majority rule, everybody votes on how the resources will be used. The idea of a true majority rule, though, is impractical simply because it's not of the population. I mean, you just think about it, there's 7 billion people on this planet. There's 318 million within the United States. The majority rule wouldn't work. So representative governments have been deployed. That's what we have here in the United States is we vote to create representatives, and the job of those representatives is to determine how we're allocating scarce resources, which would include the money that the government brings in through taxation. So the success is dependent on voters to act on behalf of social interests as opposed to self-interest, and that is one of the major keys here, is that in order for representative governments to actually be truly successful, voters must act in the way they feel that it best represents everyone involved as opposed to it represents themselves individually. So there's a big difference there. A second way is contests, and contests allow contestants to compete for scarce resources. So an effective contest would allocate the greatest portion of resources to the winner, but everyone is working to earn that prize. So in this case, we've got some scarce resource that we're having a contest to earn, and everyone is fighting to get that. So we're going to see progress across the board as people try to gain access to that scarce resource. So when we look at some more ways, a first come, first served basis. So allocating resources through a first come, first served basis process can be effective. And I notice here when the resource can serve just a single user at a time. So first come, first serve is an effective allocation of resources only when the resource can serve just a single user at a time. So the example here, smartphone and tablet producers and how they allocate their resources. There's a reason why there's long lines outside of Apple stores every time they introduce a new iPhone. Consider the iPhone a resource as a scarce resources, and when you get in line to access that resource, it's a first come, first served basis. So if you're late getting in line, you may not have access to that resources for several months. Opposition to this method would be to share all resources equally, which if you look at the reality of it and you look at how practical it is, that's not necessarily something that can take place. One of the reasons why planned economies fail is because the concept of sharing all resources equally is pretty much in opposition to how humans interact with each other. We interact with each other in a way that's going to best serve ourselves. If we're interacting in a way to best serve ourselves, then the idea of sharing resources equally simply isn't going to occur. And so the question is, but how would you implement this process fairly? And really, it's almost impossible because humans tend to serve their own self-interest. So another way here is the lottery. Scarce resources can be allocated through lotteries in which tickets are provided and the winners are allocated the scarce resource. The absolute best example of this is the allocation of slots to certain schools in large school districts. In fact, they did an entire documentary on the Washington, D.C. school system and how this lottery literally impacted the lives of so many people. And that's because you're talking about the best schools in the district, and you're basically creating a lottery system to see who actually goes to those schools. And so when they win, there's a huge amount of joy, but at the same time, there's also a huge amount of sadness for those kids who end up going to these worse schools because they didn't win that lottery. So parents enter lotteries hoping to gain access to the better schools in the district. They do this in Nashville for magnet schools. They do this in large districts, New York City, Washington, D.C. And so you see this pure elation when your children are able to gain access to these better schools. This family here, in fact, they were excited because of the fact that they actually made it into the single best school in the Harlem School District in New York City. And so that's a big difference because you remember, education is a massive factor in terms of human capital. The more education we have, the higher the standard of living we can obtain. So the lottery is a big, big deal in these areas for school districts. Okay, so the next one is personal characteristics. So our personal characteristics lead us to allocate resources differently. And that's the thing is all of us are different. Humans, like I said, tend to serve their own self-interest. When we talk about time as a resource, time is a valuable resource, and it's often allocated through personal characteristics. How we use our time varies. For example, right now, for me, it's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving in 2015, and it's not even 6 o'clock in the morning, and so I'm allocating my free time to do this so that I'm not doing it some other time. So there's a how we allocate our resources. Most of you as students are probably asleep right now at this exact same time. And so this method of allocation, though, can lead to discrimination of scarce resources. That's one of the things is personal characteristics. So like we said, it allocates resources differently, but it also creates discrimination within scarce resources. So I want to give you some examples here. So one of the major examples, prime example, is segregation of African Americans throughout the late 19th century and the majority of the 20th century. I have 2 degrees in history, a master's in history, and I've taught college, and this was a major subject within our discussion and our coursework as we looked at this segregation and this allocation of scarce resources through personal characteristics. So I've got some pictures here that'll help you kind of identify this. So we want white tenants in our white community. So here we have the allocation of resources in terms of housing, and by personal characteristics, they're discriminating against African Americans and they're only housing white families. Here we have this Imperial Laundry Company. We wash for white people only. Once again, allocation of scarce resources through discrimination through personal characteristics. And of course, literally up into the mid-1960s, this was completely legal. Rex Theater for colored people. In other words, here we have the other side. So in this city, we literally had a theater for white people, but we also had one for colored people in this sense because they were discriminating. So we're saying, okay, look, if you are not going to allow us to attend this theater, when we're going to create our own, and we're not going to allow you to attend that one. So one of the things about the personal discrimination, it wasn't just discrimination from white people against black people in the sense of scarce resources. It also went the other way from when we look at the scarcity of resources, and African Americans did that because of the fact that they had no other choice. They had to discriminate against white people because of the fact that they had scarce resources that were being allocated, and they had to ensure that their families and their friends were allocating and got those resources. So this was a part of the literally the majority of the 20th century with personal characteristics creating discrimination for allocations of resources. And we still have that today in many parts of the country, not just the South. Okay, so the next way is through force, and this is the last one we'll look at. So force plays an important role in the allocation of resources by governments in the form of taxation and transfer payments. So when we look at that circular flow model, and I just pulled this out, you know, the government, what they do is they tax the population and they tax firms, and then they transfer that money. But how they transfer that money and how they gain access to that money is through force. I mean, if you think about it, you're required to pay taxes. In fact, when you have a job, they don't even give you the option. They take it right out of your paycheck. So force is being used to collect those taxes. Force is being used to determine how that money is being transferred. The use of force can also be negative, as history has repeatedly shown. I mean, if we look at the majority of wars that have taken place on this planet, the majority of the wars that are taking place are gaining access to scarce resources, whether that be land or, in this case here, when we talk about water. So I've got this, will there be war? So you think, oh, so all the water on Earth, only 2.5% is fresh. And look at this, less than 0.007% is readily available to people through rivers, lakes, and streams. So when you think about it like this, you've got a global population of 7 billion people who are trying to access 0.007% of readily available water, of which only 2.5% of all water on Earth is actually fresh water. In other words, as water becomes more scarce, think about California and the years of drought they've had, that creates the potential for conflict. And so we see that conflict over allocation of resources is a fairly constant thing that takes place throughout our history. And so we have that, but at the same time, the legal system works to force people to conform to the contracts they've signed. This is a major part of business. When businesses sign contracts with each other to allocate resources, they sign contracts. If one side doesn't conform to that contract, you end up with a situation in which you've got lawyers involved and you've got all this money that's being spent in order to ensure that that contract actually occurs. So there's a lot of different ways to allocate resources within those markets and all the way through those planned economies. So it's not just that there's one single way to do this. There's multiple ways in which countries allocate resources, and for that reason, what we see is the majority of economic systems on the globe are actually mixed economies. So even though we may say someone is communist or someone is capitalist, the reality is there's some mixture of gray. It's not really black and white in the sense there's always these shades of gray when it comes to economic systems.